last day of RSA, everybody. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, I'm Ben Edwards. I am a senior data scientist at the Scientia Institute. We are a research organization that works with wonderful companies like Elevate Security to do all kinds of fantastic cybersecurity research that hopefully helps everybody improve their security at home. And I'm going to tell you a lot about it today, but first, here's my co-speaker.
Thanks so much, Ben. Good morning, everybody. Masha Sadova. I'm co-founder and president of Elevate Security. Elevate Security is a company that focuses on human risk management, and we really spend a lot of time helping quantify what makes a risky user and help companies actually remediate that. And we have some really exciting research to share with you all. Ben and I have been working together on both the research and analysis of this problem for several years. And funny story, we met for the first time in person in the line to get into this talk. So
right over there.
Wonderful to be here physically with you all today. Before we get started, hey, here's a disclaimer. Y'all good? Read it? Yeah? Okay, wonderful. Why do we want to talk about this topic with you all today? So human risk, employee risk, workforce risk, depending on what you call it, is one of the largest unsolved problems in security. According to the Verizon Data Breach Report, 82% of the incidents that they looked at last year, 82% were due to a human factor. Of those, phishing factors were nearly 40% of that, and use of stolen credentials was about 30%. So yes, the human element is a huge problem, but it is really largely unsolved. If you think about the skills and the tools we use for other elements and disciplines of security, we have something that we're either directly or indirectly familiar with, which is risk management, right? The concept that we need to prioritize our time and energy are things that are most critical. And how do we define most critical? Something that has the most impact, the most likelihood of happening, understanding how risky is this threat. And yet, we don't actually apply this kind of concept very often to the understanding of human risk of our employees. In fact, when we think of our employee factor, it's often a one-size-fits-all approach. Employees are this general population of people who are risky and cause us vulnerabilities, right? And if we understand the problem only at this level, we only have the ability to apply one-size-fits-all approaches, which is why most of us get redundant annual security training, which we click through right at the very end. And that's not a very effective way, as we've seen with the 82% of actually remediating this problem. So one of the motivations of this talk, and one of the things that I want to offer you all to think about as we go through this research, is the ability to quantify this risk. So we start painting a picture. We start seeing that risk is not evenly distributed, as is true in many other aspects of security, whether or not it's patching or incidents or audit or vulnerability management. Same thing with the human element. Risk is not distributed evenly, and we're going to show you exactly where that looks like, how that looks like, and where that's distributed. And that enables this opportunity for us to be able to actually start applying interventions and tackling this risk in a much more meaningful way, so that some people in your organization can actually have lower interventions, lower touch points from security, reduce the friction, and some people will need a higher touch point. And so this is the framework that I want to offer you all to think about why this problem is even being discussed, why we do this research. Because the journey to understand what risk looks like in our organizations will enable us to actually start meaningfully changing our approach to this. So as you saw by the title of this talk, we are absolutely going to dive in and understand what it means for the pandemic and how that shaped workforce risk. But before we can go into that discussion, we need to lay a little bit of foundation around what does it mean to be a high-risk user? What does it mean to be a risky user? How do we define that across organizations? And what are the trends without a pandemic in the mix so that we can understand what happened to workforce risk, human risk during the pandemic? So I'm going to hand this over to Ben to walk us through that.
So the company I work for, Scientia Institute, is really great because we get to work with companies like Elevate and do awesome research that is available for free. You can go download these 2 reports. And generally, I am a stats guy, and so I like really, really interesting data. So as part of my job, I get to work with all kinds of companies that have really, really interesting data, but Elevate has some unique stuff. So in particular, I'm going to talk about some results for the next, 10 or 15 minutes here from these 2 reports that we've done in the last 2 years with Elevate. And then you guys are going to see the COVID stuff, which is never before seen. This room is it. Besides Masha and I practicing the talk in our hotel rooms, you'll be the first to see it. So brand new stuff coming down the pipe. But as Masha said, we kind of want to lay some foundations and talk about how we got to this idea of human risk and high-risk users, and how we want to see how that changes the dynamics of that over the course of kind of the times around the real chaos of the pandemic. So these two reports, the first one, the size and shape of workforce risk, we published about a year ago. High-risk users and where to find them was a couple months ago, fairly recently. And what these do is we looked at about 170,000 users and 15 million user events. So like opening an email, reporting some phishing, potentially going to a sketchy website, these kinds of things for 3,800 departments over 8 years. So we have this really big corpus of data that allows us to look across a bunch of organizations rather than kind of focusing on your organization and seeing how, say, phishing or training is working within your organization. We can actually see kind of broader trends. And this is the cool thing about my job, is I get cool data that we can talk about. So the first thing that Masha put in the threat Venn diagram was the idea of threat. And so this is from that first study. We wanted to look at the distribution of how many phishing emails individuals are receiving kind of on a yearly basis. That's this threat, how often they're actually hit with emails. And something that comes up just a ton in our work is that things are really varied. So the first thing I point out to you is this is kind of using a visualization technique called the log scale on the horizontal axis, where each of the tick marks is actually an order of magnitude rather than kind of a linear increase. So we're going from 0.1 to 1 to 10 to 100 rather than kind of fixed jumps. But the point of this being is because things are so spread out, this is the only way to effectively visualize it. So each of the dots here is about 1% of users. They are kind of crunched up around the middle to give you a sense that most people are in there around that median of 33.4%. And then there's this dot way out on the left that's slightly bigger than the rest. And what that actually represents is in the data that we measured, about a little more than half of users have never received a phishing email. Never received it. These are users that you probably don't have to worry too much on that threat access because they're never going to get the real phishing that's the problem. So absolutely, don't ignore them completely, but they should be lower on your priority list. Now, among those, the 48% who have had it, they average a little less than, or median, it's not really an average, a median of about a little less than 1 per week, 33.4. But again, there's a lot of variance. There's people who receive, 3 a year, once maybe a little less than a quarter. But there are these email addresses. I'm going to use the laser pointer. I'm going to try to not overuse it. Out here at 1,000. So these are potentially these public-facing email addresses, high-profile users who are getting 3 phishing emails a day. That is an incredible amount of threat that goes into that should go into that risk calculation to think about, oh boy, we should maybe think about special things for those kinds of users. So beyond the threat, there is also this what's the behavior, what's the risk for those users. So among those 48% who had received them, and we're actually going to kind of reduce that sample set a little bit further down to the 10 who have received, or to users who have received 10 or more phishing emails, about 80% of them, even though they've received 10, have never clicked one. So that 48%, now we've reduced it, another 80% have never clicked an email. So they're actually pretty good. You have this big differential. And then 20% have clicked at least one. That's that red on the side. Now we can break that 20% down further, and we actually can make a histogram here of where these users end up with their kind of click rate. So among those 10, what percentage did they click on? And about 75% of users do so less than 10% of the time, less than 1 in 10. So most of those users, and people make mistakes. This is no indictment of those 20% or 48%. This is just, sometimes it happens. But those users are still it's pretty low on the risk rating. But I again point you way out here on the right side, a small minority of users, about 1%, click more than 80% of the phishing emails they receive. So you really hope that the ones that are clicking 80% are not the ones receiving 1,000 a year. But this really shows that risk differential between some people get none, some people who get some are very good about it, and some people who get some are awful. And so these are the people in your organization that are keeping your CISO up at night that you really need to worry about.
And as a practitioner, why that's an incredibly valuable set of information to understand is back to it's no longer a one-size-fits-all approach. What we're showing in the data is actually there's 4 categories of individuals that will require 4 different types of interventions, right? There's people who never receive a phishing, who aren't on the risk threshold. There's people who regularly do, but never click. There's people who do click, learn from it, and don't go back to bad behavior. And then there's people who are hopeless, right? And how we tackle each of those categories is really critical because they will require different types of touch points from the security team.
Yeah. Hopeless is sad, but I mean, I think we all know somebody.
Yeah.
Right?
I just need a little bit more bubble wrapping is what I was saying to say. Yeah.
Exactly. We can kind of do similar type of analysis with other types of risky behavior. This is kind of just a pretty looking chart, but really what it is 2 stacked bar charts. On the left side is the percent of users. And what we see is about a little more than 2.5% of users have had more than 2 malware events. But the ones that have had more than 2 malware events, usually some of them have a lot more than 2 malware events. And so they account for actually like 92% of all events. So we can think about this as kind of that 80-20 rule, except here it's like a 3% 97 or 93% rule. So a really small percentage of users are going to account for a huge percentage of the events. We have this kind of middle orange bar that fills in the rest. They've had a few events, but not too many. But 96% have never had a malware event. So, should they have AV software on the computer? Absolutely, but we maybe don't have to worry quite as bad about those 96%. We can do the same thing with kind of maybe a more commonly engaged in risky behavior, which is browsing policy violations. This is, your internal filters on your DNS or whatever controls you have in place. Flag a website that one of your users is going to that they shouldn't be. Again, we see a differential here, not quite as big as malware and not quite as big as phishing, but about 12% of users account for about 71% of all the secure browsing events. And these users are hitting 750 or more websites they shouldn't be per day. That means we have a flag of like, they tried to access this URL and they shouldn't have been there. Again, there's this breakdown. Some have 10 to 750. That's another 24%, and that accounts for nearly everything, right?
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
I was going to say browsing itself is not nearly as terrifying of a behavior as malware and phishing, but it is a precursor behavior, right? So you're able to see the mindset of individuals. Do they understand what it means to end up at the dark corners of the web? And as we think about browsing to risky sites as being a precursor to landing on phishing pages or landing to websites that are hosting malware, this ends up being a very interesting signal to further risky behavior as well.
Right. And I think that is a fantastic segue, and that's why I like giving talks with you, is like what we'd like to do is understand those users holistically, right? So malware is one thing, phishing is one thing, secure browsing is another. What we'd like to do is be able to kind of come up with a measure that covers all of those things. And so we did come up with this idea of a high-risk user. And so a user is high risk, and this is kind of a big sentence, but I promise I'm going to explain it. A user is high risk if they are in the top quartile of users in their organization who have engaged in risky behavior. So remember back to that malware chart, we said 52% of users have never had a phishing email. And then of those, 80% have never clicked. So what we want to look at is that small percentage who have engaged in some type of risky behavior, that small slice of 20%. And then we're just going to look at the top 25% of those, right? Because it'd be silly to classify people who have never had an event as a risky user. And then it'd also be silly to kind of classify everybody who's had some type of event as a risky user because, again, mistakes happen. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of look at those top quartile of those who've had an event. And this allows us to compare across different types of behaviors. So like I said, secure browsing is more common than malware and phishing. But we want to be able to say, like, am I high risk in this category, this category? Or like, maybe I'm in both, and is there a correlation there? And we want to do it across organizations, because organizations just have different risk profiles. And so for one organization, being in the top quartile probably means something different than being in another organization, which I'm actually going to specifically talk about in the next slide. Oh man, I love when I set myself up like that. So what does this mean to be a high-risk user? For most organizations, like I said, it varies quite a bit. So for something like the phishing click rate, it's about 8%. So if you have a user who's clicking 8% of the phishing emails that they receive, for most organizations, the middle is about 8%. It's a little bit higher for simulated phishing. And I think this is sort of a trend, is that people are more likely to click simulated phishing emails than the real ones. So maybe they're too good. Malware events, it's a little less or a little more than 1 a year. Secure browsing, it's about 4 a year. But what I want to point out here is the second column, which is the maximum threshold. Because I said this is organization specific, some organizations just have more risky users in them. So for example, secure browsing events per year, the kind of highest organization, somebody would have to get up to 177 events per year to qualify as a high-risk user for that organization. So again, there's different risk profiles, and I just wanted to show that it does vary quite a bit for different organizations.
So this slide, while maybe a little bit unassuming, is what I think the most impactful slide in this whole deck. And I want to spend a moment explaining why. I often talk with security teams and CISOs, and they say, how do I understand how to benchmark my organization? How do I know if my workforce is riskier than others? Am I accepting an appropriate level of risk in my workforce, or do I have an unacceptable amount? What is a good distribution of user risk in organization? And the data set that we looked at for this analysis, as Ben was talking about, is the largest of its kind to my awareness, with nearly 200,000 employees over 8 years. So the benchmarks that we're showing you here, the median threshold, is one of the most impactful data sets that I'm aware of in the industry today around how you can understand where your risk distribution lies in your organization as compared to what other organizations, enterprises like yourself are doing related to human risk. So measuring your phishing click-through rate, understanding what part of your population are clicking 8% or more, is a really valuable place to start benchmarking your performance. So I wanted to just make sure you all had that context. Yeah. It's an unassuming but very powerful slide.
And that the size and shape of workforce risk, that report, we go into a lot more detail about like how many events per year this is for other organizations, what you can expect. So you can kind of see, are you in that tail or are you kind of in the middle? Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things that we found in that report is that when we take a look at all of the enterprises who have these kind of high-risk users, it falls into about 12.5% of employees will have these high-risk populations around it. So on average, 12% of an organization will cross these median thresholds.
What does this mean for all those negative events? So we have our definition. We can kind of think about those charts that we made up. These high-risk users account for about 30% of real-world phishing, less than half of simulated phishing, more than half of the secure browsing incidents, and 42% of malware incidents. Now, I think this is interesting because we've defined this as such a small percentage. Remember, it's a small percentage of users engage in any activity at all, and we're just looking at the top quartile of those who do. If you could focus on that really small percentage of users, like 12%, and you could reduce these kind of incidents by this much, man, fantastic, right? Like that's a huge impact to your organization as far as the stress that you feel and the work that you have to do when these incidents happen. Okay, so where are these high-risk users?
Yeah, so this is the part of our talk where there's audience participation. I would love for folks to shout out, what department do you think has the highest amount of high-risk users in it? IT. Finance. HR. Customer service. I thought it was marketing. I will put my bias out on the table. Ben, what was your vote before we did this data?
So I guess I would think IT. I thought there was hubris there.
Sure.
Yeah.
What do you think? Management? We're going to get to that question later.
We are going to get to that because management's everywhere, right? Yeah. Okay. All right. So we just looked at departments for the first one. Who said customer service? Somebody had read the report. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. and so this is basically looking at that kind of across all those departments. We'll take our definition of high-risk users, all the users in that department, what percentage of them are high risk. And so, like I said, the average here is about 12%, so we could think about kind of a line going up at 12% and think about who's above and who's below average for these departments. And I think there are some interesting things. I was wrong about IT down here in the bottom quartile. And that's good. They're practicing what they preach. There's a few kind of that I point out are maybe a little weird, like the board is down there at 1.5%, but that's a pretty small sample size. And I kind of doubt that they're opening their own emails a lot of the time for an organization. So maybe they get a little bit of a pass. Is there anything else that you like on this one?
I mean, customer service makes a lot of sense. They have a lot of public-facing work, but R&D really caught me by surprise and also really scares me, right? There's a lot of, in customer service, yes, there's a lot of customer-facing data, but R&D has some really privileged information that's very highly interesting IP often. So, they're two very different types of personas in an organization, which then led us to the next question.
Right. Oh, and also data analysis, my people.
Your people.
Oh.
Yeah.
Where exactly or what type of high-risk users these are. So we're going to do a little bit of a breakdown because the different kinds of behaviors do have different profiles. So the columns here are the 4 different types that we've talked about so far. The rows here are, of course, the departments. Each of the columns is actually colored by within the column because the percentages are so different for high-risk users in each of these behaviors. And so, I think I'd point out, malware tops out about 3% of users are high risk in malware, where it tops out at like 20% for simulated phishing. So the colors kind of hopefully normalize to the columns and get you thinking in that mode. So things are interesting here, like malware, we have never detected, somebody have a malware incident from a medical lab. However, they're quite bad with secure browsing and real phishing. They're among the top, they're that deep red there. There is also this kind of big difference between real phishing and simulated phishing. The customer service at the top of that overall departments was in a large part driven by simulated phishing and secure browsing, but they actually turned out to be quite good with real phishing, right? And I think in general, you'll notice there's an opposite thing with R&D. They are pretty good with simulated phishing, but quite bad with real phishing. But there is this general difference in where that risk is located for these two things that should be correlated, right? They should be measuring each other. And we've hit on this before in previous work, is that simulated phishing is maybe not as correlated with actual behavior as we'd like it to be. And so that's one thing to consider when we're thinking about that. All right, question number 2.
Show of hands. Okay, if you managers or not managers, who do you think? Who in the audience thinks that managers are going to be the riskier population? Raise your hand. About a third.
Okay, all the managers have raised their hands.
Okay, and non-managers, who thinks the non-managers are riskier? Okay, that looks like that's the winning vote here. And what is it?
Managers nearly across the board are the riskier behavior. I wonder if that was just a poll of how many people are management versus non-management in the room. So yeah, almost across the board, managers are more risky. 3 exceptions, HR, QA, and sales. We'll highlight them here with our little boxes. I note here that the differences aren't huge. So for example, HR, it's a little less than 1%. QA is 2%, 3% there. So this is not like a big differentiator, but it certainly is, significant in the sense that managers do tend to be dependent, no matter where you measure them.
Yeah.
There it is.
Yeah. All right. Next question: contractors versus non-contractors. Show of hands by who thinks contractors are going to be riskier? Okay, the majority of us. Non-contractors. Okay. What is it?
Ooh, there's a transition. Non-contractors.
Non-contractors. Yeah.
Yeah.
This one is also one of the biggest surprises for me. I definitely thought that contractors were going to be the riskier population, which, just as a side note, one of the reasons I was really excited about this data is it really questioned some of the assumptions and biases that I had around where I thought high risk was. And I realized I was coming into this conversation with anecdotes, right? Like, oh yeah, that Bob in accounting, he's not good, so people in accounting must not be good, right? And so realizing that if we take a data-driven approach around it, you kind of see some trends that are against what collectively we have come to accept as norms of what is good or bad, what are good or bad populations.
Just some data nerdery. There's no, so non-contractors across the board. Purchasing being one difference. Oops, I'm going to go back there. I did want to point out board and creative. We didn't have any samples there, so there's a blank there. It'd be weird to have a contractor on the board, so I guess that makes some sense. And then there are some bigger differentials here. So look at marketing, 17% to 4%. Customer service, again, the non-contractors are 23%. You contract somebody for customer service, it's really low. So there are some bigger differences here as opposed to the manager, non-manager.
All right, last question for you all. So we took a look at the distribution of risk across different types of levels of the organization. So we have the CEO and the C-suite, we have middle management, and then we have frontline employees. All right, so raise your hands if you think it's C-suite. Okay, middle managers? Okay, again, all of you are against the management teams here. And the frontline employees? All right, I think frontline employees and CEOs have the same vote, with the majority of us being into middle management. You're right, middle management.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got it right.
It's again not a huge difference here. It's about a little more than 14.5%. And so those are the highest risk, or like dead in the middle, like halfway from the top to the bottom of the organization. The way we did this is we reconstructed the org chart and looked at kind of what percentage of the way down from the top or up from the bottom an employee was. And the ones in the middle were the ones that were most likely to be a high-risk user.
And for those of you who are in the back, the bottom level is to the left, C-suite is to the right. So
Correct.
You're moving up the org to the right. So
Yes.
C-suite is still quite risky, right, with about a little bit over 12% there, but not nearly as bad as middle management.
Right, yeah. Okay, COVID-19 and workforce risk. So we did take a little bit of a detour, and we established this high-risk user stuff, but we do have this really awesome work, because once we understand what a high-risk user is, once we have a handle on what these behaviors are, we can talk about how it changes in time with these kind of global events. And Masha's going to get us started.
Yeah, so as Ben was saying, we wanted to create an understanding of where risk is distributed regularly, and then understand what shocks the system, like a pandemic did to this system. So first I wanted to walk through a couple of areas of really amazing research and studies done by a couple of other research reports, and just bring it all together. So this is done by Fortinet on the left side, and then the F5s on the right. And what these charts are showing is that, in fact, yes, phishing attacks, and there was an increase in attacks that really did significantly spike during the start of the pandemic. That you can see there's kind of small labels on the bottom here, but in the March-April timeframe, the amount of phishing emails and attacks leveraging the word corona or COVID shot up significantly. And the F5 perspective, same thing, same concept. This is looking at the number of certs and websites registering with, again, these kind of words. So leveraging websites to trick people into giving up credentials or falling for these attacks. So attackers, as we are all well aware, are shameless in leveraging current events and using these to really have significant spikes in the kind of phishing attacks that we were seeing in the market. What was really the second corollary of this is, just because we're seeing words or websites being registered, did this actually lead to incidents? And yes, that also spiked by 15% according to the F5 report. Yeah. And so you can see in the red chart here, this is looking at incidents dealing with phishing from 2015 to 2019. In comparison to 2020 in yellow, how many incidents were actually needed cleaning up and responding to. Again, shooting up significantly over the course of the pandemic, which makes a lot of sense, leveraging chaos and that work from home time. What was really interesting in the analysis is actually what happened to ransomware. What you see here on the left-hand side was actually for the first half of sort of the core pieces of the pandemic, the core few months of the pandemic, right? So April all the way through November, there really wasn't a huge spike in ransomware incident, but really starting in the beginning of December, you're seeing a huge spike, significantly showing up, 7x increase to 17,000 devices reporting ransomware per day. starting in December of 2020. So it kind of actually created this corollary experience where there's phishing at the start of the pandemic, and then as we're moving into the later half of 2020, we're seeing an increase in ransomware and malware attacks. What you're seeing in the right-hand side, the Mitigating Ransomware Impact report showed the initial start, it's January through October of 2020. That big spike in the middle is again the November-December timeframe, and it's remaining at a higher level than it was before, but really that November-December timeframe into January had an all-time high in the period of the last few years around ransomware. So this is what our employees were receiving, our workforce was receiving, right? These phishing attacks, these ransomware attacks being directed at employees. But we wanted to take a look at the data set that we uniquely had and said, well, we understand what employees are clicking, what people are trying to download. How does these type of attack factors actually affect the employee behavior and what they did at home? So I'm going to hand it back to Ben, who's going to walk you through what specific workforce risk and decisions employees were making in context of this threat landscape that our employees were receiving.
So yeah, now we get to the data nerdery again. So the cool thing about the Elevate data is we have these kind of individual user tracking, and so we can think about like, how could we start to establish how user behavior changed in these really chaotic times? So first thing we wanted to do is establish a timeline to where we might want to think about doing this analysis. We kind of broke it up into the 6 months, the before time and the after time. So the before time is September 2015, or September from 2019 to March 2020. I remember being at RSA in 2020 and kind of watching CNN in the Marriott lobby and being like, oh boy, this is exciting. And then between March 15 and April 15th, it was just chaos. Lots of states did lockdown. We have this little visual here. Here are ones that I could find on Wikipedia and when they actually decided to do kind of statewide lockdowns. And this was really chaos. And we wanted to like not match that kind of noise that was happening as companies tried to figure out what was happening, but look at kind of the 6 months, April 15th and after, to see people had settled in, work from home. This was a new thing for a lot of companies, and how the behavior that we knew they were already measuring had changed between the 6 months before and after. And so we have this kind of matched time period. We have users that we can match together. So what did we actually do? This is what I think would be generally called a natural experiment. We don't have a control group, unfortunately. There was no group of users who never experienced the pandemic. I wish, right? But we do have this kind of idea where we have a control of how they were behaving before, an intervention, which is lockdowns and everybody go home for at least 6 months, and then what happens afterwards. So we're going to calculate the event rates, malware. We're going to look at simulated phishing and some training information, which we haven't actually talked about yet today, and training information because we had a large sample of users. We had good data before and after, and these seemed to be good candidates for this type of experiment. And then we're going to test the change in risky behavior on a user-by-user basis kind of before and after. So for the sample that we had, we'll just give you kind of one headlight up front. Phishing, the simulated phishing got a little worse. So on the left-hand side is the click rate. So in that 6 months ahead of before, users clicked about 9.3%, and then after it was about 1% more, about 10.3%. So people got a little worse when they were working from home on those simulated phishing emails. Okay. By the way, we also looked at report rates. This actually got significantly worse. And by the way, to the right for all of these, we're going to say to the right is worse. So notice this is actually the non-report rate. This actually tripped us up when we were working on the presentation. But we wanted to make sure everything to the right was worse. So higher is bad here. And in the after period, it's about 10% higher. People were much less likely to say, yeah, I got this phishing email simulated or not. But they were much less likely to say, yeah, this is what happened. Simulated phishing is not all that that's sort of interesting, but whatever. So let's look at malware. And so this is a similar chart, except instead of like here, where I'm just taking the averages and doing some standard errors, well, it won't go back now, oh well. Where I'm taking the averages and looking at some standard errors, we actually wanted to look at the whole distribution of malware events kind of per year. We do some normalization here. We have this matched 6-month sample, but some users were not present for all the periods of the 6 months, so we want to make sure we calculate for that exposure. But what I'd point out to you here is kind of in the before period, the purple, we have kind of most users, or this is again a log scale, about 0.3 events per year, so 1 event every 3 years. We have a small group of users over here who have a lot of events. There's a little bit of yellow down here. This mass, the yellow mass after has maybe moved to the left a little bit, but it's kind of hard to say. But one thing that we'd think about is like, well, are these users, did they all move over here in the after period? Was the users' percentages here, are these the ones who moved up? We want to know how that changed, not just kind of like, did the average change? But were the high-risk users the ones who were changing? Are low-risk users getting worse? Are low-risk users just getting much, much better? And ask those kinds of questions. So what we did is we looked at the ratio for each of these users and looked at their before and after ratio. So to the left here is users who got better. They had like a 0.1 or 0.01x decrease. And to the right is worse, 10 times extra increase. And what we can see here is like, wow, there's a lot of users who got much, much better, which meant they probably had high rates to begin with, but they managed to not have any incidents afterwards. And then for the most part, the users, even around that 1% did shift, or that 1x where they didn't kind of move too much, did move to the left some. And in fact, we can kind of plot this out, and I love this chart because it's pretty, that if we look at the malware event rate before the lockdown, we have these users who had 30 events per year, something like that, more than 1 a month. They had a ton. For the most part, in the 6 months afterwards, they were much, much lower, like 1% of where they were before. Now, like as a stats nerd, I was like, well, is this just regression to the mean? And the truth is no, because if it was regression to the mean, everything would kind of be gathered around that line, or at least in a slope kind of evenly distributed across that horizontal 1x line, but it's not, right? These high-risk users actually got much better. We could maybe think about this as just kind of regression to the mean of those users who were kind of bunched up around there. But in fact, we can do some testing and say, yeah, most users, the mass is down here. They got a little bit better on malware. So when you sent all your employees home, for some reason they had less malware incidents. We can think of a lot of reasons that might be the case. Maybe they're working from home on their own equipment that doesn't have quite the same instrumentation as the stuff that is in the office. But this was an effect that we saw. To kind of summarize some of the results here, simulated phishing, these are all relative rates. So for example, the simulated phishing click rate, I said it went down from 10 to 9, or 9%, it went up from 9 to 10%. That's about a 7% relative increase. The non-report rate went up. But interestingly, things like training, their incompletion rate went down. People were sitting at home in their kitchen, and they decided, you know what, I'm going to finish that training that I've been putting off, and HR won't yell at me. And in fact, they got it done on time much more often. That's that bottom line. And then, like I said, the malware events, they went down quite a bit. Quite a bit. We saw quite a big change there. So that is the stats nerd experimental stuff. And I am going to give it to Masha because she is the expert on what you actually do with this.
Yeah, we want to spend the last few minutes of our time together instead of just showing you digging a hole and saying, wow, did you know you had all these high-risk users in your organization? Good luck. Want to spend a few minutes.
And the pandemic changed a bunch of things.
Yeah, giving you a little bit of actionable thoughts around, well, what do you do with this information? Hopefully at this point we've proven to you that risk is not distributed evenly and that there are absolutely pockets of risk in our organization, and that the pandemic and big events shocks to the system really do change it. And so the understanding of individual risk really helps us be able to pinpoint who might need different kinds of attention, but what would that look like if we actually put it into practice? So if I had one slide that I could give you all around how you might actually take this back into practice, it's this one. So the first place I really want to just bring your attention to is this bell curve we started the conversation with, right? So when we measure risky user behavior, right, whether or not it's in malware or it's in browsing habits or in phishing, we're seeing that this type of bell curve happens, right? So on average, you're going to see about 12% of your population will be in this high-risk category. If you're an all-star organization, you're going to be a little bit more in the medium risk. But you also have a pretty large population, you're green. Right? But then how we might apply interventions, and I use that word very intentionally. I'm not saying the word training, because training is an appropriate way to course correct on behavior for a subset of the organization. But clearly it's not it's not the right tool for everybody. And so wanted to offer some additional ways of thinking about how we might apply different types of interventions to different levels of risk. So starting with training is a good baseline for the majority of organizations. Hey, did you know this is how you detect simulated phishing or real phishing, or malware is being sent to you. Please don't click on any unknown executables. But then as we move up and people make these repeat mistakes, as we've been seeing, or naturally create higher risk or higher risk decisions, we might want to increase how we're interacting with them, including providing targeted feedback, including their managers. And when we understand individual risk and an individual behavior, we can actually give much more targeted and thoughtful feedback to the employee, letting them know what they're doing well and what they're doing poorly so that they can course correct. But then we have this second category.
I think they're maybe moving the walls in one of the other rooms.
Yeah. This is the drum roll towards our grand finale, I guess. Moving about like adjusted controls and adjusted access. If you remember a few minutes ago, we talked about maybe what do we do with these, I called them hopeless, but higher risk users or more vulnerable users. So I wanted to introduce a concept of adapting security appropriately to these individuals. And this is a new concept that both Forrester and Gartner started talking about just recently this year about how do we adapt the right kind of security to the right person at the right time. And at the very end is HR escalation, which I'm not really going to spend a lot of time on because we understand like sometimes there are people who really do need to have a conversation with HR. But what I wanted to offer in this particular chart is that there's actually a lot of optionality for us in between the training and the firing somebody in an organization once we understand where that risk is distributed. So I want to spend just a few more minutes on the adaptive security. So if we have a high-risk employee, right, someone who falls in our 12% is downloading malware or browsing to sites, thinking about creating a security experience for that person, right, where we're up-leveling the kind of MFA they have, right? So maybe we're prioritizing phish-resistant or passwordless MFA for that individual as the first go of how we protect that particular group, or potentially ensuring that they can only log in via VPN or on only trusted devices, right? So these folks may not be the ones that you're going to be allowing BYOD. If you have someone who is medium risk, right, having a different kind of MFA policy might be totally okay, right? So maybe one-time password token-based might be okay for this kind of individual. Maybe they're allowed remote connections, and maybe they can only have active reviews quarterly as opposed to more frequently. And then we also have this incredible opportunity where we realize a huge portion of our population is now actually low risk as well. And that's an incredible opportunity in which we can enable innovation and speed of security for these people. So can we can extend their MFA timeout, right? So they don't have to log in nearly as often. Maybe we even tie it to performance bonuses, right? Where really good performance over time can be acknowledged at a financial level. Shorten the type of audit and training that we give these kind of individuals because they've already passed the final exam and are doing excellent behavior-based results. And their access can be reviewed on a much more infrequent basis because they have earned the trust of the security team. And so I just wanted to create this kind of understanding that we think about security often out of necessity with large sweeping policies, but if we understand that risk is distributed quite dynamically, right, we can think about the tools and resources we have available to us as security teams and apply it more granular than we are doing today with a one-size-fits-all approach. And so to wrap us up, I wanted to just go through a couple of key highlights that we walked through with you all today. One, risk is not distributed evenly. There are truly a small number of individuals who are disproportionately responsible for a large number of incidents. And they are concentrated in specific populations. We talked about customer success and R&D being some of the highest risk populations. Managers, bless their hearts, are some of our riskier populations. And it's also not static, right? People's life circumstances change. Sometimes all of our life circumstances change in the concepts of in context of a pandemic or COVID, but measuring employee risk is an ongoing conversation, right? Because people's circumstances do change and how they make security decisions can also move and change. And we think about, when we took a look at the COVID pandemic, COVID pandemic and how it affected security, we saw that in some cases, it helped with training performances, right? And malware actually improved. Phishing had only a slight change in this. And so the very last slide we have for you all is what do you do with this information? What can you take away? What do you do next? I would encourage you all to think about in your organization, your workforces, how are you understanding workforce risk today, right? Are you able to is it a broad sweep, right? Is it one size fits all? Is it just department based? Can you think about measuring it more granularly at an individual level? And if so, what are the kind of behaviors you might start looking at? We recommend the ones that we looked at, malware being for an impact, phishing, same thing, browsing as a precursor to some of the riskier behaviors, but understanding where your risk distribution lies. And feel free to use the benchmarks that we laid out to understand where you all are from an organization standpoint in comparison to your peers and your risk distribution. And thinking about adapting security controls to bubble wrap your higher risk users in a more meaningful way than just yet more training or the HR policies that we set out for them. And so with that, I believe we have 5 minutes, 4 minutes maybe, for any questions anybody has. But Ben and I are also going to be around afterwards, and feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn. We're happy to connect you with the research reports that has a lot of this information in a lot more detail. And also, these slides are going to be available, as is this recording, and they also have the links to the research report. So happy to take 1 or 2 questions. I think we have a few lined up.
Did you happen to notice any psychological, sociological, or cognitive attributes in the data that you were looking at, where an organization might be able to predict who would be riskier instead of having to wait and experience it?
Yeah, that is a wonderful question. We intentionally choose not to collect that because that moves us into a minority report kind of situation, right? And also the line between security credit score, we understand people's past behavior versus profiling. So we haven't moved into that space, although it is very interesting from a security standpoint. But from a ethics perspective and understanding how we might leverage that information, we've intentionally chosen not to go down that, even though personally I'm quite interested, right? Are there other attributes? So we've intentionally not asked the data of that question.
Because it seems like, although I think that what you've done is really good to recognize that not everybody is as risky as everybody else.
Yeah.
There is no median. It still seems that it is reactive behavior as opposed to proactive behavior.
Yeah. Well, if you think about how our society deals with security, or just with credit scores as a whole, it really does. I mean, you start relatively neutral because there's no information around what we do, but then it's our behaviors and how we handle debt and credit that will affect that. If we were already sort of set in stone with because of your gender, demographic, zip code, like if that was already set, that feels entirely, I would say, unfair, right? And it feels like we should actually have the opportunity to prove or disprove behavior. And so actually looking at repeat offenses as a way of protecting future offenses is the most likely and I say ethical way of understanding how we might secure our organizations.
And this is not like a replacement for resilience too, right? So your organization should have other stuff in place so when bad things do happen, it's not the end of the world, right? But this can lesser the kind of, the right side of some of that stuff down in the future. Mm-hmm. So yeah, and there's a concept from criminology like the ecological fallacy. Just because you're a member of a group that this has happened, there are other reasons also like institutional that may be the case. And yeah, that's a really great reason not to look at that kind of information. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hello. So I'll just speak for myself. It was hard to wrap my head around the data because in all of your slides, you only cited sources on like 2 or 3 slides. So I didn't understand how the data was collected, where it was coming from. Was it self-reported? And then on some of the slides, like the 0 phishing emails received, is that user reported? Because I have a hard time believing that. right? It kind of brings up the Mark Twain quote, right? Lies, damn lies, statistics. And where is the data collected from? And then the risk, you know, you look at the most well-known publicized breaches, the LastPass breach, right? He was hacked because he had third-party insecure software on his computer, right? And you guys didn't look at that at all. He would fall into your no-risk category, right? And so, and then another comment that you made that you kind of just brushed it off. You're like, well, maybe they were working from a non-corporate thing and we didn't have the telemetry, right? None of that was in the slides. And I think that makes them more risky, right? Because you don't know, right? And you know, you have professional email companies that can't distinguish between, oh, this is spam and this is phishing, right? And so to make definitive statements on, hey, these people received 0 phishing, did they, or did they just not know it was phishing? I had a hard time understanding, you know, especially where you don't lay out the data, where you got it from, you know, all of the things that help you understand the data in context. That would have been helpful up front.
Yeah, thanks for that feedback. The data is collected through integrations with security tools like endpoint, email gateways, web gateways, so it's not self-reported. It's an ingestion of the log, so we work with the companies that these employees are members of and ingest the logs that understand what decisions employees are making. Do they click on link? Do they get these emails that are received? Are they browsing to sites that are policy violated? And so this is where the data sets that we were referencing at the beginning have come in. And so understanding all of these security decisions as a function of the tools that have recorded and logged these employees' decisions across dozens of organizations and the employees that are members of them. And so all of the data sets, with the exception of the ones that we cited towards the start of the pandemic, are sourced or uniquely our research and our data sets related to the organizations that we worked with related to user risk. And so we haven't cited other parties because it's unique to our data set. And so it's all Elevate and Scientia sourced.
And I would say things for like phishing emails. There are organizations that have tens of thousands of employees. Their email addresses are non-public. And so the likelihood that a phishing campaign is going to be able to craft an email that specifically goes to a particular user at a particular domain may be pretty low. I would also say events like the LastPass breach, yeah, he was low risk, and things do happen to low risk users, but that is much more rare than happening to high risk users. And in fact, it's the everyday incidents that I think most security professionals deal a lot with. And the ones that make the news are big and bad and terrible and affect a lot of people, but that's not the majority of most incidents. And so, you know, doing that balance between, like, can we plan for everything? Absolutely not, right? And sometimes you're going to have bad things happen to low-risk users. But on the other hand, most of the business of the day is these users who we have information on and who have had these events before. So those are the ones, if we can focus on those and mix those. Sorry, I'm being yelled at to stop.
I just wanted to make one comment.
Yeah.
And the gentleman that said we were being reactive.
Yeah.
Don't we do security awareness training? So aren't we being proactive?
Yeah.
But then people aren't learning or listening or whatever?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Thanks so much,
Thank you so much.
everybody.